What becomes very clear in this next passage, the last part of chapter 5 in Luke's Gospel, and the first bit in Luke chapter 6, what becomes clear is that Jesus, what he is teaching, what he's on about, the whole new experience of life that he brings of God to people will not and cannot fit with what Judaism had become under the Pharisees. It becomes very clear that that the Jewish faith, the religion of the day, had become a joyless, grim, legalistic religion. We probably could think of examples today around the world of extreme fundamentalism, and there would be probably some very close parallels between how the Pharisees applied the law of God and religious tradition and minute interpretations of the law on every aspect of your lives. It seems probably for us a little alien, something that we are not used to, unless we've come out of a religious group or church where legalism has been the order of the day. Then we would be able to relate to these things more clearly. It's interesting, we think of, who were the Pharisees? But we probably should say, who are the Pharisees? The Pharisees are still with us. And sometimes they're a lot closer to home than we realise. To take higher moral ground and to judge one another is to have the spirit of the Pharisees in our hearts and motive. Perfectionism. I've said before, a good definition of a perfectionist is someone who takes great pains and gives them to others. Well, the Pharisees were perfectionists, par excellence. They had got it down to a fine art, but they had a way of choosing which laws they wanted to get perfect and ignoring others. They also had a way of applying it to others more than they did themselves. I'm feeling quite justified here this morning. I have a number of grandchildren, and the numbers keep on growing. And I know, not that it's a competition, but that I'm getting well ahead of some people here. Not that I would look down on you, but the blessing of God has clearly been upon my little clan. By the end of the year, all being well, we'll have 6. Sorry, no 6, 7. You know something I don't know. We can take pride, and we can get a bit self-justified on pretty well anything at all. So really, the heart of the problem that we see in these chapters, if we think about it, we could see how that works out in the ways we come into conflict with others. Often behind conflict, and there's conflict in this chapter, deep hostility. But often behind deep hostility is a demand by one or two people that their way is right and it must be adhered to. So let's get into this chapter and get a bit serious, shall we? That's what we're talking about, very serious religion. And probably that's the other comment I would make. It is easier to see something of the grimness of Pharisaic religion in the other person. It is very difficult to see it in ourselves. there's a growing concern, hostility toward Jesus and the way he's operating with his disciples. And we know from earlier in the previous chapter, in chapter 5, that the Pharisees were raising questions about Jesus' behaviour in forgiving sins, accusing him that he's blaspheming, claiming to be God by taking on God's role in forgiveness. So when we come to this verse in chapter 5, verse 33, we have a question about his disciples' behaviour. Now, the disciples of Jesus didn't act like the disciples of John the Baptist, or even of the disciples of the Pharisees, which may well be the disciples of the scribes. How could they be called disciples if they don't fast and pray? Yours go on eating and drinking, the question's raised. Now, this question, who does it come from? In reading Luke's Gospel, you would assume that it comes from the Pharisees, because Luke simply says, they said to him. John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking. But when you look at the other Gospels, we discover it's John's disciples that come asking this question. In other words, the disciples of John the Baptist. And Mark tells us that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees were fasting at the time. So that's where the question is arising. They're fasting. Why aren't your disciples fasting? And Mark goes on to say some people came. He doesn't identify them as disciples of John. And he says, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Luke simply says they. He doesn't identify who they are. Without the other Gospels, it would be easy to assume that this is a loaded question, veiled criticism by the Pharisees. Those who came may have included the Pharisees as well as John's disciples. What we can say is that there's a growing disparity between Jesus and Judaism in the way it had taken shape in Jesus' day. And that behind this question may well be an honest inquiry, but it probably does reflect a wider groundswell of criticism that Jesus' disciples don't actually look like real disciples. You know, they don't act like disciples of a religious leader. They just enjoy eating and drinking. And maybe the thought that they were just partying didn't fit. They seemed lax and lazy. They seemed incredibly slack in regards to praying and fasting. Their devotion seems to be to the feasting. The Pharisees, they fasted twice a week. They had strict habits of fasting, Mondays and Thursdays. They often whitened their faces so that they looked unwell, so that others would be impressed with their piety. I don't do that. This is actually just the way I look. Sorry. They actually only fasted from sunrise to sunset, and then they could eat after the sun went down. So it wasn't a huge burden. They weren't fasting for, a number of days, or they weren't fasting for 24 hours. It's interesting how we can make something look more strict and demanding than it really is, just to impress. Religion for the Pharisees was a very serious business. And we don't realise how serious and how upset they became when they saw the disciples of Jesus enjoying the pleasures of eating and drinking. The Orthodox Jew believed that if your religion did not make you feel uncomfortable, it was not true religion. So they'd reduced their relationship with God to a set of rules. Isaiah had a word to say about that. These people come to me with their mouth, they honour me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is only of rules taught by men. How do you worship God wholeheartedly? How do you love him with all your being? Just by keeping the rules. And we can think of the elder brother who kept the house rules but didn't really love the father, his father. In the Old Testament, fasting was commanded by the law 1 day a year, Day of Atonement. But there are many instances where there was fasting going on, but not commanded by God, but as a response to people in their desire to seek God and to return to his ways. But there was also fasting that was condemned. Isaiah 58 brings us a very powerful passage about the emptiness of religious discipline, like fasting, if it's not done with a genuine love for God. Isaiah 58 verse 2, for day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. So here's a people who look like they really love God and want God and his ways. They say, why have we fasted and you've not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you've not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarrelling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for a man to humble himself? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying on sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, and when you see the naked to clothe him, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? That's real fasting. It doesn't look like fasting. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, he exposed the hypocrisy of much of the fasting that was going on. When you fast, do not look sombre as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. Jesus doesn't discourage fasting, but he won't put the burden of fasting on his disciples. It's interesting, he gives very little teaching regarding fasting as such, but in response to the criticism, he makes it quite clear that it would be inappropriate for the disciples to fast while he is with them. Why so? Can you make the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? What does he mean? Well, in Jewish weddings, the guests of the bridegroom, or the phrase is the sons of the bridal chamber. You didn't go away on a honeymoon, you stayed for a week and you got married and the celebration just continued. That would be fun, wouldn't it? No honeymoon, Mum and Dad, the friends, family, stay around. No, we want to get away. Get away. Escape. No, the sons of the bridal chamber, the groomsmen if you like, were there to make sure everyone had a great time. And to feasting, dancing, festivity. There's something of the joy of a Jewish approach to the wonderful gift of marriage, to celebrate. They understood that. And Jesus is saying, can you make them fast while they're with the bridegroom? Of course you can't. That would be absurd. It's a time of huge joy and celebration. He goes on to say there will come a time when there will be fasting, when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. It's interesting. Remember Jesus in John's Gospel, we're told that there would be a time when the disciples would feel Christ's absence. He would leave them and they would grieve. But their grief will turn to joy. Just like a mother forgetting the agony of childbirth once she has that baby in her arms, so when the disciples see the risen Christ, they will rejoice and no one will take away their joy. So in other words, yes, there will become a time when it will be appropriate for the disciples to fast and to grieve and to mourn. But in the light of Christ's presence and in his ultimate risen presence with his people, joy is the order of the day. There's no place for a serious, sombre, self-conscious religion. That is utterly blown apart by the presence of Christ. Now look, there might be times when we should mourn. James speaks to those who are fighting and quarrelling over the things of this world, those who just live for the world's pleasures, who are captured by the evil one's lies and his desires, and his counsel to them is grieve, mourn, wail, change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. So there is a time for mourning, for fasting maybe, when our hearts have become hardened against God and against one another. But if we know anything of the love of Christ, if we know anything of the love the Father has lavished upon us, if we know anything of the love in the Spirit, then we will understand that our place is to return to joy, and that joy be the order of the day. Even in Nehemiah's day, when they were reading the law which had been forgotten, and they were weeping, and the counsel by the leaders to them was to stop grieving, for the joy of the Lord will be your strength. And they were told to eat and drink and to send portions, to share food and to celebrate with great joy, because they had understood the words that had been made known to them. So there may be a time, and there is times, when we should grieve and fast and seek the Lord. But that's not the place where God would have us stay. It may be that if we give more time to rejoicing in the Lord, the tempter would have less opportunity to seduce us with the empty pleasures of this world. A heaviness of spirit can lead us to look for worldly substitutes to lift our gloom. Or we could become like the Pharisees and think we're on a serious mission for God and for what is right, and beware anyone who gets in our way. We can go either way. Jesus was not encouraging a light-hearted, frothy faith that feels nothing of the great weight of God's glory and the great need of this world. But he knew our need not to be utterly overwhelmed by our own unworthiness. So he says, how can you not rejoice if the bridegroom is with you? But who's the bridegroom? That's the question. What's Jesus talking about? This talk about a bridegroom. Yeah, sure, there's celebration at the wedding. And sure, in a Jewish situation, it keeps on going because you're there to feast and to rejoice. But what's that got to do with you and your disciples? You see, the problem is they don't know who it is who is amongst them. He is the bridegroom. He is the one who's come to woo his people back to himself, to lay his life down for his beloved. He has come so that there might be a great marriage between God and humanity. John the Baptist recognised that. Remember what he said? He said, the bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom, who looks after his needs and makes sure he gets to the wedding on time, he waits and listens for him, and he's full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is complete. You see, John the Baptist saw himself as an attendant, a helper for the bridegroom. Who is the bridegroom? Jesus. In the Old Testament, the metaphor of the bridegroom is applied to God. And the cry of the Old Testament is, return faithless people, for I am your husband. And now he comes. The bridegroom comes to the faithless people to declare that he is their husband, and he's there to have them come back to him, just like Hosea accepts back his faithless wife. Can you see, therefore, their problem was that they did not recognise or were willing to acknowledge who he was. If they did, they would understand that this should be a time of great joy and celebration because God has visited his people with salvation. Jesus goes on to say that that what he brings is completely new. Now this next illustration is a bit difficult to grasp in our day because a lot of teenagers like to get an old pair of jeans and patch them up. And you can probably even buy clothes new that have already got patches on. So it's a bit confusing for the younger generation. But here, Jesus says no one tears a patch from a new garment and puts it onto an old one. Because you'd wreck the new garment. That's a silly idea. Why would you do it? You know? It's like, why would you buy jeans that have already been ruined because they've been put through an acid wash? I mean, that would be stupid. They're not going to last long. Yeah. It's hard for us to read the scriptures because in those days they had common sense. So you'd put it on and it wouldn't match, and it's not about the colour, it wouldn't match the strength. The new patch is strong material, the old is weak, and you've got to imagine a Jewish garment that had been worn for years. You can't just go to Target and buy a new one every 6 months. A well-loved, well-used garment. But it's old and it's falling apart, and you put a nice new patch on. But the whole thing's going to fall apart, and it's going to pull apart from that patch, and it'll be ruined. So what's the point? So you want, talking to the Pharisees primarily, you want me to bring my teaching and just attach it to Judaism. It's not going to work. It's going to pull apart. It would ruin what I'm bringing. And it would just wreck what you've got anyway. Or it would be like pouring new wine into old wineskins. Now, they didn't use bottles for wine. They used maybe a goat skin. They would take the skin off the goat whole and then just tie up the ends of the... We don't have to... Okay, people don't like that idea. And then you'd fill it up, and it would be fairly flexible. It would have stretch in it so that as the wine ferments, it would be able to expand. My wife, some years ago, made a batch of ginger beer, and it blew the bottles up in the cellar. Another time she gave it to me and it was still fermenting, and it nearly blew me up. You don't put new wine into old, hardened, dry, inflexible wineskins. They'll burst and the wine will just flow out. I was watching a program the other night on POWs in World War II, and they would make alcohol out of anything they could grab. They would make alcohol, and they'd hide the still up in the ceiling of the POW camp where they stayed. And sometimes they would explode and the Germans would wonder, what was that? Where have they got these explosives from? And one mouthful of it could make the whole lot of them sick. But they still went for it. But it fermented. They learned how to ferment the wine. Fermenting wine produces gas. And what Jesus is saying is, what I am bringing can't be contained in the rigid, inflexible structures of Judaism. It needs to find new wineskins. It needs to have room to move and to grow and to bubble up and to create life. So you want me to put my new wine into your old wineskins? No way. It won't work. There must be new wineskins. And then he says, no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for he says the old is better. And here Jesus simply, recognising that the Pharisees weren't going to change. People often like to just keep hold of what they know, what they're used to, and they'd rather not try the new. Now, Jesus is not saying, look, you've got to throw out everything that's pre-2000. Like always changing, always throwing out. And he's not saying that there's nothing. At another place he says that the kingdom of God is bringing out treasures, both from old and new. So we've got to be careful how we understand this. It's easy just to want to sweep off all the old ways of doing things and just bring on all the new. And you'll have me playing drums in a Perspex box and making a racket. Look, that may not be wrong either. But you know what I'm saying. We can just so change everything that we've lost the new wine. We've got something fermenting that's altogether different. But what Jesus is saying is, you Pharisees, you love what you got. You're not going to embrace the new wine. And yet that's exactly what they needed. When we come to... we just probably make a comment that we all need to continue to be renewed in the gospel, so that, if you like, the wine skin, the container of of the life that we receive from God, retains its flexibility, its ability to expand, to grow as it receives greater understanding of the truth of God's grace and purpose. History of the church shows how the problem that Judaism was stuck in, how it had grown brittle and hard, that tendency has constantly, continually found expression in the history of the church. There is no question. And there needs to be the miracle of having renewed wineskins all the time, so that we don't fall back into that place where we cannot possibly cope with God doing something new in our midst. Jesus was making it clear that a self-righteous, legalistic, joyless religion is out of line with the salvation that Jesus is bringing. In chapter 6, again, this opposition, this criticism, again of the disciples. This time the Pharisees see them picking some heads of grain as they're walking through the fields, rubbing them in their hands and eating the kernels. And the question is, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Now, what was unlawful about that? Well, they had taken the law of not working on the Sabbath and they gave it a particular application at every point of life. In terms of crops, no harvesting. And to pick corn with your hand and to rub it and to take out the kernel was harvesting, reaping. It was unlawful. And to break the Sabbath law was extremely serious. So this was no minor little criticism. This was a very serious allegation. And Jesus' response, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? This is King David. Or David, I'm not sure whether he was king at that point, but he was heading for the position. He entered the house of God. He took the consecrated bread, the showbread, the bread that signified the presence of God, and he ate it. And that was only lawful to eat by the priests after it had been, it finished its purpose, it was put away, and it could be eaten by the priests. That was the law. But here David breaks it. So Jesus says, look, here's a law of God that is not applied absolutely. And you are not complaining that David did that. In fact, you would say David was free to do what he did. So if that is true for David, then could it be that this law of the Sabbath and your traditions that you've built around that law can also or should not be applied in that absolute way? He goes on to say that that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. They might have said, well, look, it's okay for David, King David, to do that. But who are you to break God's law? Who is he? Well, he's the Son of Man, who is the Lord of the Sabbath. And again, if they understood who he was and his authority, then they would not question his actions. And on another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and he was teaching a man there. As he was teaching, there was a man there with a shriveled hand. And the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, they were looking for a reason to accuse him. They were watching closely to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath. Because to heal on the Sabbath is working. And so breaking the Sabbath law. And Jesus knew what they were thinking. And he said to the man with the shriveled hand, get up and stand in front of everyone. Why does he do that? So that everyone can see the shriveled hand. It may be that some around would have known. The Pharisees now could see, okay, now it's going to happen. He's going to heal this man, and we've got him. And then Jesus asks the question, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? And he looked around at them all, and then he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and that man's hand is healed. He did so, he stretched his hand out, and it was completely restored. But they were furious. That really shows the lack of any sense of compassion or love in a legal heart. He'd asked them a question. They were used to being asked what's lawful. People would often say, oh, tell us what's lawful, what's right. Can I do this, this? And they would say, yes, no, you can't do that, yes, you can do that. Or if you do this and that, you could do that, but not that and that. That was their job. So Jesus says, okay, do your job. Tell me what is lawful. Is it lawful to do good or to do evil? Would not it be evil to leave that man with a shriveled hand when you have power to heal it? Now, Jesus could have waited till the day after the Sabbath, but he would not. Is it legal, lawful to save life or destroy it? Here he was going to restore life, and here they are planning to destroy life, to destroy Christ. And he looked at them all, and not one of them would answer. Not one of them had the moral courage to give the true answer. Mark's Gospel, he tells us that Jesus was provoked in his heart by their lack of compassion. It tells us that he looked around at them with anger. Jesus looked around at them with anger and was deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. And then he said to the man, stretch forth your hand. That gives some insight into Jesus' attitude to the hard-heartedness of a human being when you would rather stick to your rules and regulations than relieve the misery of a human being in great need. Their hard-heartedness distressed him. So, he's healed and they're furious. It's interesting. They cared nothing for the man, his shrivelled hand. They were not interested in relieving his shame and his sense of uselessness, because how could he work with a shrivelled hand? All they cared about was their particular cherished interpretation of God's law and their tradition. And when God provides this miracle, they have no intention of rethinking their interpretation of the law. They deny God's goodness, and they just want to make sure such a miracle never happens again, and that the person who's committed that miracle finds justice. That's what they're on about. They were zealous for keeping God's law. Jesus didn't criticise the Pharisees for teaching God's law. In fact, he said that they sat in Moses' seat, so you must obey them and everything they teach you. But don't do what they do, for they don't practice what they preach. He said, woe to you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you give a tenth of your spice and mint and dill and cumin spices. You tithe them. You've neglected the more important matters of law, justice, mercy and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. Can you see, Jesus doesn't encourage his disciples to revolt against the Pharisees, or he does not encourage the crowds to not listen to their teaching regarding the law. He says simply, don't do what they do, because they are not doing what they're saying. They were plotting to kill him, and that continues to build as you go through the Gospels. The very people who claim to be zealous for God's holiness have murder in their hearts. Unless we think that could never happen to us, think again. No, we need such a revelation of the new wine of the kingdom that we would not forget the truth of mercy and compassion and forgiveness and a desire to restore people and not destroy people. It would be easy then, on this basis, to throw out every moral judgment as Christians. Some churches have chosen to become so broad in their interpretation of what it means to be Christian in our day and age that it's very difficult to identify them as Christian. And they would gladly say, if you're a Christian and you stand for something, you're like the Pharisee. I believe that would be a wrong interpretation of this passage. Jesus stood for the moral truth of his Father's commands. He didn't fudge them. He didn't reshape them to fit the spirit of the age. But he did move out in love and grace and forgiveness and mercy. And whatever he laid on others, he came in fully to support them and to energise them with his power so that they might discover and obey the goodness of God's commands. Let's pray. Dear Father, thank you, dear Lord, that you have shown yourself to be a God, a holy God, who gives good commands for the blessing of the one who's made in his image. You made us, dear Father, to reflect your glory. You've shown us the way that we are to live. But Lord, you've come to restore us who have broken your law and restore us so fully and freely that we now know forever that we are eternally loved. And to know, dear Father, that there is no failure, no falling, that you cannot come and bring forgiveness and cleansing, and new hope and new joy. Thank you, dear Father, for your word, and thank you for the encouragement of being together under it. In Jesus' name, amen.